Hey everybody, Jeff Urbin here, your old pal from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, speaking to you live here with the Roosevelt Story. And today we are going to talk a little bit about the Great Depression. I hope your summer is going well. We're coming up on the midway point of summer. I can always tell it's midway through summer because most of my 4th of July bottle rocket injuries are beginning to heal quite nicely. So we are going to talk today about the Great Depression and the way that people made it through difficult times in the Great Depression. Now, if you've been paying attention, and I know you have, you'll notice that things out there in the world are a little bit, well, shall we just say strange, right? The economy, the job situation, the weather, the world situation, politics. So there's a lot of crazy stuff going on right now, but try not to be worried about it. Try to just take it with a grain of salt. We'll get through it just like the Roosevelts did. That's one of the most important things that I've learned about history is the more you know about history, the more you're able to understand and conceptualize and departmentalize, and then be able to move on from there. And we've been in tough times before. We will be in tough times again, and we will get through those. So let's take a look at how a generation of Americans got through a difficult time in their lives. So we're talking about the Great Depression, which is a very sad state of affairs. And in 1929, of course, the stock market crashed, and it seemed to be the start of the Great Depression for most people. Now, farmers had actually been suffering through the Great Depression for almost 10 years before that, with the Dust Bowl and the great drought that was going on, with farmers losing their land, the Dust Bowl, the land picking up into the sky, blowing away as dust and such. But it was the 1929 stock market crash that really got everybody's attention. It's kind of like when you're not feeling well for a few days and you're like, oh, I don't know. Then you take your temperature. It's like, oh, I've got 103-degree temperature. Well, no wonder I'm not feeling well today. That's kind of what the stock market crash was. So before we get started in learning ways that people work their way through this difficult time, let's take a look at just how difficult this time actually was. During the Great Depression, there was 25% unemployment. There was 25% underemployment, which means that people had jobs, but they weren't jobs that were good enough really to sustain themselves. During some parts of the Great Depression, farms were failing at 1,000 per month. Banks were failing at 1,000 per month. The suicide rate tripled because people had just given up. They had lost hope. The marriage rate went down, right? Because, people couldn't commit. I don't know what the next couple of years are going to be like. I don't know what the next couple of months are going to be like. I don't know what the next couple of weeks are going to be like. I can't commit to you. The birth rate went down, and also divorces went down a little bit, but not a lot because it takes money to divorce. So the abandonment rate went way up. John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist, was asked if he'd ever seen anything like this before, and he said yes. It was called the Dark Ages, and it lasted for 400 years. All right, so that's how bad things were. Now, the Great Depression was not just an economic crisis. It was also a social and an emotional crisis as well. Families either broke up with, let's say, a 17 or 18-year-old son being asked to leave the family because there just wasn't enough, to go around and feed that young person. This is where the hobo culture begins, going out and trying to find jobs, riding the rails. Sometimes families collapsed in on themselves. You might have a grandma or a grandpa who, couldn't live on their own. And so they would move in with your family there as well. Generally speaking, prior to 1933, there was very little help from the federal government. We're talking at about a time where there was no Social Security, there was no unemployment, there was no disability protection, there was no job programs, there were no national labor relation boards to work for workers' rights, and there certainly were no stimulus checks. So if you needed help, you might go to a rich uncle, and if the rich uncle still had money, maybe they could help you out. If you couldn't turn to family, maybe you turned to your church or local community organization. If they couldn't help you, maybe you turn to your village, your town, your state, your county. But the problem with the Great Depression was so many people were in trouble that these places were tapped out. And so there was very few places that you could go and look for help. So you had to survive on your own wits, and you had to survive by your own efforts. And you would be okay if you had some of these following things going for you. If your supply chain was local, and when I say local, I'm talking the yard or the farm. If you were living on a farm and could raise chickens, if you were living on a farm and could raise crops, then you were able to do a little bit better than you were, let's say, if you were in a city where you had no access to farm animals or land. You might be okay if you knew how to do stuff. If you knew how to fix things, if you knew how to make things, you could repair things that were broken, you could fix things on your own and make well that way. You could also do well if you pooled resources with others. This was a time of people coming together to pool the things that they had. You know, I've got some potatoes, you've got some tomatoes, they've got some chickens. Let's put together and we'll make a meal out of this as we come along. And you also could do well if you swallowed your pride and asked for help once it was able to come along. A lot of people in the Great Depression didn't want to accept the dole. They didn't want to go on the dole. They didn't want to accept assistance because they were so proud, right? This was this American idea of, you make your own way in the world and, you support your family. And if you've got to take a handout from somebody, charity from somebody, that was considered to be a really shameful thing to do. So there was a lot of shame, there was guilt, there was shock, there was embarrassment. People who had been doing very well in the 1920s suddenly weren't doing very well, and it was a hopeless mess. All of these things were common emotions that people were going through. And the Great Depression was an incredibly big deal. So let's take a look at how people lived through it. Now, one of the things I think is really important is that a lot of people that lived through the Great Depression, it changed them. They were never the same again. And I can remember my own grandma. She lost her life savings in a bank disaster, a bank run during the Great Depression. And whenever you saw pictures of grandma after that, she always had this big black pocketbook that she was holding. And I asked my mom one time, isn't it funny? Every time you see a picture of grandma, she's got the big black pocketbook. And my mom said, well, you know what she had in there, don't you? And I said, well, no, it never really occurred to me. She said, about $30,000. Grandma had lost money in a run in the bank and never wanted to be without her money again. That was the mindset. Even with the FDIC, she never trusted banks ever again. In fact, grandma had this little thing right here. Let me go in a little bit closer for that. We do this here. This is a thing she had hanging in her bathroom. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. And this was a very popular saying during the Great Depression. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. And if I had a nickel for every time my grandma said that, years and years, well into the 1970s, 1980s, she was still saying that because she had been through, the Great Depression. So the first way to survive this was you had to have the appropriate mindset. And one of the things was waste nothing. And people from the Great Depression wasted nothing. And if you talk to people from that time period, most of them are probably gone now, but their children might remember, I remember my uncle always ate the entire apple, right down to the seeds and the core and everything. He would waste nothing. When you had, let's say, a turkey for Thanksgiving dinner, right? That turkey would start off as a roast and it would show up the next day as a sandwich and it would show up the next day as a soup. And then when there was nothing left but bones, they would be ground up and put in the garden for fertilizer. So you absolutely wasted nothing. And you also tended not to buy things. You tended to use what you had. So again, use it up, wear it out, make it do. The make it do part of what was going on there. This was a time when people really understood the difference between needs and wants. Yes, I might want a new shirt. Yes, I might want, a new dress. But what I really need is a warm coat. What I really need is a great set of boots. And so this was a time when people really had a sense of priority about what do we really have to have and what would we like to have. And we'll put the like to have down the line and we'll put the need to have what we have going on right now. It was also a time when you tended to help your neighbor. If you talk to people from that era, sometimes they'll say, well, we didn't have money, but we had everything. right? Because somehow they were able to find these things that they needed, either through friends or through family or through the neighborhood or through a local charitable organization. Later on, when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president and begins to create programs like the CCC, the WPA, the TVA, then of course government assistance is coming in, but you also still depended upon folks in the neighborhood as well. Frugality was a huge, let's say, trait that you needed to have, right? You had to be frugal. You had to make that penny stretch. You had to make that nickel stretch. And I remember hearing one story about a guy who had gotten paid, and he got a job, gotten paid with cash, came home and was showing his wife the cash on the front porch, and a nickel fell out of his hand, rolled down underneath, fell through a crack in the porch, and he spent the rest of the afternoon digging around under the porch looking for that nickel. That's how important that nickel was. Now, I know what you're thinking. What? Crawling around under a porch looking for a nickel? What about, aren't there snakes and brown recluse spiders and those sorts of things under there? All that for a nickel? Well, keep in mind, it was the Great Depression, right? So a lot of the snakes and brown recluse spiders were out looking for work as well. So it maybe wasn't so bad. But the point is, that nickel made a difference in that house. And that's why he needed to go under there and to do that. Now, it wasn't all, trauma and turmoil through the Great Depression. People tried to go into it, again, with a mindset of, we will make the best of this, right? We will make do with what we have. And so in terms of fun and entertainment, libraries became very, very visited, right? People didn't have money to buy books. You could go down to the library, get yourself some free books for entertainment. People took great advantage of the local parks, whether they were local parks or state parks as well. Beaches, picnics became very popular, and also game nights were very popular as well. And two of the important games that came about at this time, one was Scrabble, and the other was Monopoly. And Monopoly was this, you've all played Monopoly. Monopoly was kind of an interesting game because it gave you a sense of control over a small economy, even if it wasn't, the real economy, and the real economy had, put you under. At least you could, play with your kids or play with grandma around the table, and you could be able to manipulate that as well. Church socials and potlucks became big events. This was an opportunity for you to share what you had, to share with what others had, and also a chance to socialize so that you could talk to other people who were in the same boat, right? Again, some people would say, we didn't really realize how poor we were because everybody was poor. And when you're getting together with folks in the same kinds of situations and you're able to talk about these kinds of things, then you're able to get a sense where, well, you know what, maybe we are doing pretty good. Maybe we are making the best of what it is that we're able to do. Now, my grandma was always talking about the Great Depression. As I said, it changed her life. It changed her position. And one of the things that she always talked about was how they had to make their own fun. They had to make their own fun. And there was a game that they liked to play, and she taught me how to play it. I want to share it here with you. I can remember which of these settings we want to go to. Nope, not that one. Let's go to number 4. And this was a game that she played very often. Now, this was a game that was either referred to as dots or squares. Now, according to my grandmother, this, whether you called it dots or squares, was very important. Some people insisted upon calling it dots. Some people insisted upon calling it squares. And if you got two people that were on opposite ends, a fist fight was commonly to occur. My grandmother liked to refer to it as dots, and her sister, Peg, liked to refer to it as squares. And this is a sheet of a game that they were playing. And you got the K for Kate, that was my grandma's name, and Peg was my aunt's name. And so they've got this game going on here. And all it is simply you put the dots along here, and then you take turns putting the lines in. And if you can complete a square, then you are able to put your initials in there. Now, one of the things I found so amazing about this is that this game of dots or squares, depending upon who you're talking to, was actually written up on the back of the eviction notice that my grandfather had gotten. So clearly, these people in the Great Depression totally knew how to use everything, right? Nothing went to waste. Got an eviction notice? Hey, let's play dots or let's play squares. We got to make the best of this as we go through. Games such as sing-alongs, you would get together, play the piano, sing along, pass the night away. Musical chairs was a lot of fun. You might get together and pool together and make fudge or taffy at parties. On the radio, comedy shows, very, very popular, very, very important, because it gave you a sense to lose yourself in something light, something airy, something a little bit upbeat. The mini golf craze also took off during the Great Depression. And thousands of miniature golf places started off across the country. You could play around for as little as 25 cents. There were also endurance-a-thons that were held in communities. Again, the idea of bringing people together, having fun with very little resources. So there might be a dance-a-thon. There might be a rocking chair-a-thon. There might be a hula hoop. Actually, hula hoops were later on. There might be a knit-a-thon. All these sorts of things to sort of, pass the time away, and to pass the time away in a positive way. Also, high school sports was very important because, you could do that locally, go to the game. It wasn't that expensive. And boxing was also very popular, especially on the radio, which, obviously had to be some kind of interesting thing to hear that, and the guy hit the guy, and the other guy hit the guy back, and the other guy hit the guy, and the other guy hit the other guy back. So I don't know, I guess in the Great Depression, you got to do with what you got to do with. So those were some ways that entertainment was put together. And then there were little tricks and gimmicks that people used throughout the Great Depression as well. In some places in the country, in order to keep warm, they would actually burn corn. The corn prices, the farm prices had gotten to be so low, it was actually more economical to burn the corn than it was to burn wood or to burn coal. You weren't going to get any money for the corn. Here it is. It's a ready resource. Let's go ahead and use that. Also, you might be sent out to pick up coal along the railroad tracks. Coal that would fly off. The locomotives at the time, of course, were all powered by coal. And so what you might end up doing is going out and seeing if you could scurry up any coal that way. Sometimes people in the cold mornings would get dressed under the sheets in the morning. Rather than get out and get cold, the best way to not be cold is not to get cold. So you pull your clothes in, get dressed underneath the covers, and then you get out and you're a little bit warmer that way. In days like today, which are very, very warm, very hot, very humid, you didn't have air conditioning. You were lucky if you had a fan. You were lucky if you had electricity to operate the fan. So you might cool things down by putting a wet sheet over your window. And as the wind would blow through, it would bring in the moist, damp air and help to cool things down a little bit that way. You also would be involved in things like bartering or borrowing, right? So again, this was a time when you didn't have a lot of money, to go out and buy things or to go out and rent things. So, these socials, these church socials, the potlucks, those sorts of things were an opportunity for people to talk back and forth. And somebody might say, well, I always have to, I want to, get this thing fixed, and I got to get this thing repaired. And somebody might say, well, I've got an old stove in the back that's got exactly that part you're looking for. I'll give you that if you give me some of those tomatoes. I walked by your house the other day. I saw those great tomatoes out there. And so you would barter, you would trade. You would, borrow things from folks. Even something as simple as an apron, right? Wearing an apron while you cooked prevented your clothes from getting dirty, so you didn't have to wash them as often. And this is something that folks back in those days really understood. When you do your laundry today, right, and you put it in the dryer, and then you take it out and you got all that lint, what is that lint? That lint is your clothing. It's your clothing coming apart. And so every time you wash your clothes, you were really actually putting them through quite an ordeal, because you were putting these things, through water. You were putting them through detergent. You were, wringing them out. You were hanging them up. You were drying them down. And in order to make the clothes last longer, very often you would try to get 2 or 3 or maybe 4 wears out of those clothes, right? If it wasn't dirty and it wasn't smelly, hang it up and you can wear it again another day down the line. Or you would wear an apron, which would prevent you from getting stains or also burns, while you were cooking, and those sorts of things. Little things like that made things last longer. We talk about, there was a group of women called the Pack Horse Librarians. I have a talk about that. And one of the things that they did is they lent out books to people. And they always made sure that the books went out with a bookmark, because the bookmarks would prolong the life of the book, right? People weren't bending the spines or dog-earing the page, that sort of thing as well. Also, a big thing that folks did to try to make ends meet and to stretch things out is they did a lot of canning. So if you had farm produce, let's say peaches, carrots, pickles, corn, you name it. If you could can it, you would can it, and you would, what was called putting up, right? So you would put up these things for a time later on, down the line. So you would have carrots even in the winter, not just in fresh carrot season. And I've got a picture here of a woman. Let's see, where did it go here? Who has, let me just get my photos out here. Oh, do I have that? Yes, I do. Here is a picture of a woman who is quite proud of all the produce that she's been able to put up. She's got about 15 or 20 jars there, so they're going to do pretty well throughout the winter with those jars of what she's got there. And the other thing, of course, is you could always trade a jar or two of this for a product or a good or something that you needed either at the store or maybe from some other neighbor down the street as well. So these are some ways that that folks got through, in terms of these things. Rags had a million uses. So if you had a shirt and the shirt wore out, first of all, the way the shirt would be worn is Dad would wear it. And then when it got too much for Dad to wear, it might be taken down and resized. Or let's say if your baby brother needs a diaper or something like that, the shirt would be made either reduced in size or made into that particular diaper. They would be made into hair bows and things like that if you needed it as well. And then by the time you finally got down to the end of the material to a very, very small pile, then you would be even more resourceful, and you might make what was called a rag rug. And that's what this is. Sometimes they're also called rope rugs. So what you would do is you would take an old piece of rope, you would take an old rag, and you would cut it into little strips like this. This one will show better. You cut it into little strips like this. Then you take your rope and you take your rag and you make a little loop like that, put it around the rope, and then you would push through, pull up, and tighten up, and you got yourself a little bit of a thing there. Once you get a string of this going along here, you would then take some thread on the back and you would begin to fold these over and sew this together. And when you did that long enough with enough rags and with enough rope, you would end up getting yourself a rag rug, or you could use it as a rag blanket in the wintertime if it really got to be cold. You could use this rug. This was great if you wanted to get out and step, not on a cold floor in the morning, but on a nice rag. It's not the most beautiful thing, but the rag rug will keep you up off of that cold floor, certainly along that way. Also, what you tended to do was try to make things last. So, today with us, if we get a sock, let's say, if you have a sock and you pull it out of your drawer and the sock ends up looking like this, right? What do you say, right? Well, I'm going to throw that away, right? But first you might say, darn, look at that sock. And that's exactly what people did. They wouldn't throw away the sock. They would darn the sock. And they would do that by putting it over an old light bulb. And then they would just sew that sock up with needle and thread, and you would then get even more wear out of that sock. That's where the word darning comes from, I think. People find a lousy sock and they darn, and so they're able to do that. Those of you that are into the where words come from and such. Eggshells, coffee grinds, ground it up, put out into the garden along with bones as fertilizer. Newspapers and rags became insulation for your clothing or for your house, for your home, those sorts of things. My grandma also would tell the story of they would get an orange for Christmas in the stocking, and they would take the orange and they would open it and they would only eat 1 or 2 sections. And then they would take 1 or 2 sections, they would eat that, they would put the orange back on the windowsill so it would stay cool. And the next day, they would eat another section or 2. And that way, the orange lasted all week, right? And that was a big treat for folks back in those days. Garden kitchens, super duper important. If you could grow your own stuff, you had a much better chance of survival and a much better chance of making out in terms of ways to get through that in the Great Depression. You also never threw anything away. This is another thing you would find very popular among people in the Great Depression, the old string ball. And anytime you got a piece of string, you would add it to the string ball. If a package came wrapped in string, you take that string, you put it in the string ball, and you would put that in a drawer in the kitchen. You never knew when you might need this to tie up the crops in the backyard. You never know when you might need this to darn a sock, to sew together a rag rug. So you didn't waste anything. This next thing I have here is a reproduction of a thing that my grandmother always had in her house. And my grandma, whenever she brushed her teeth, this is how her her toothpaste would end up looking. She didn't waste a thing. She always said, "A dab will do ya. A dab will do ya." And so grandma used to roll out her toothpaste with a Noxzema jar so that she could get every inch, every drop, every bit of that toothpaste out of that toothpaste container. And I remember growing up, going to her house, her toothpaste always looked like this, making sure that she got every single thing. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Other ways people saved money, well, they would shower or bathe maybe just once a week, right? So you didn't have to spend money on water or heating water, coal, those sorts of things. The whole family would use the bath water. So you'd start off with dad and he'd wash up, and then mom would wash up, and then brother and sister. And, by the time you got to be the last one, you were washing with some pretty, well, let's just say that water had a lot of experience at cleaning people at that point in time. You tended to walk as opposed to driving. And if you had a bike, that was considered to be a great thing because you could bike where you wanted to go. You would maybe go out into the forest and forage for nuts and berries and mushrooms and things like that. Or you might go out even just to the front yard and pick dandelions. Dandelion salad was a very important food through that time. Sometimes families would engage in what they called selective starvation. And it's a weird term, right? But it was a real thing in the Great Depression. And what that meant would be maybe mom or dad wouldn't eat dinner so that the kids would have enough to eat. Or what that meant was that sometimes in a family, you might take turns eating lunch. So a kid would go to school and, they wouldn't have any lunch. Why? The teacher, "Why aren't you eating lunch today, Billy?" "Well, it's my sister Sally's turn to eat lunch today. I'm going to eat lunch tomorrow." This is how it was for some people in the Great Depression. Again, it was not just a pocketbook problem, it was a psychological problem as well. Sometimes people would cut corners and save money on utilities by simply having the utility turned off and say, okay, well, you know what? I'm not going to pay for the lights anymore. We'll make do with candles or kerosene or whatever. We can't afford to pay the electric bill. Some more resourceful but illegal and very, very dangerous people would install what was called a jumper. So you might make a deal with your neighbor. Hey, guess what? You get rid of, I'm going to get rid of my phone, right? But if you have any phone calls you want to make, if I have any calls I want to make, I'll come to your house and make the calls. So I will now be free of a phone bill. But I want you can get rid of your electric, and what we'll do is I'll pay for my electric and we'll put a jumper over to your house, which is basically just a cable from your electric box to their electric box, and you could cheat the electric company that way. Again, I'm not saying it was a good thing, but it was the way that people tended to make Make do. In fact, phone service in 1930, there were about 20 million people with phone service in 1930. By 1933, there were only 17 million people with phone service. So they tended to, give up their phones. If you were a professional, you might give up your office, right? Okay, I'm not going to go and have an office anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do my work right here in the house. So I'm a lawyer. I'm going to give up my law office downtown, and I'll do the law work right here on the dining room table. Or if you were an insurance agent, sometimes doctors or dentists brought the equipment home, set it up in a spare room in their house, and did it that way as well. So these were some ways that people, saved money during the Great Depression. Ways to make money during the Great Depression? Well, you could learn a new skill. If you learned how to sew, or you could cook, or you could do repairs, that was a valuable skill you could use to make money, or you could use to barter. Hey, I'll fix that dryer that you have if, I can get one of those jars of preserves off your front porch there, lady. The roller on that dryer just needs to be replaced, and I've got an old one back in the back. Sometimes people would move from place to place looking for jobs. And, one of the problems with that, of course, was as people moved around, there weren't a whole lot of jobs in the Great Depression. So chambers of commerce would put up billboards like this: jobless men, keep going. We can't even take care of our own. And so that was one of the problems that people did. You might mow lawns. You might chop wood. My grandma tells the story. She ended up, her mother ended up having to run a boarding house after they lost their farm in the Great Depression. So they ran a boarding house in a railroad town. So there were constantly, railroad men that needed just to be put up for a night or two. So they bought a house and they opened it up to boarders. And very often people would come to the back porch and say, hey, I'll chop some wood, or I'll, bring some coal in for you, or whatever, for a sandwich or an apple or whatever you might have that they could get for that. And so that's the kind of thing. Imagine a guy shows up at your back door today with a hatchet, right? It's going to be an unpretty situation. But during the Great Depression, people would go door to door looking for jobs that way. As I said, my grandmother grew up in a boarding house, and one of the things that she did, she had to take care of the sheets and the water in the rooms and things. And when the sheets were no longer any good for the boarders, then they would be made into the air conditioning on the windows, or they would be made into rope rags, or made into dolls as well. Another popular thing, since farmers couldn't really get their stuff to market, another popular thing was you start your own business. Go out, buy a crate of apples, and instantly you were in business, right? And you could make sometimes as much as $1.75 to $3.50, depending on the variety of apple and where you were selling them. That was big money during the Great Depression. Just selling these, apples from that you got from farmers, just in the crates that way as well. You might shine shoes. You might do errands. You might wash windows. You might load coal. You might clean barns, or paint a barn, or clean a stable. Anything you could do to make ends meet during the Great Depression, you would do. Make it do it out. Make it, what is it again? Sorry, my grandma was here in my head. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. That's what, and I can, if she were here, she would say, how many times did I tell you that? You can't remember that? Okay, Granny, I remember. Now, let's talk about food. Hunger was a huge problem during the Great Depression. Food was scarce. Some folks, actually starved. It's hard to know exactly how many people starved. The city, usually when people starved because they didn't have food, they die of some other, ailment that was related to starvation. So it's hard to get actual numbers of people who actually starved during the Great Depression, but there were people that did. And one of the big things was to waste nothing. As I said, you start off with the turkey, it ends up as fertilizer, and in between that, it was a roast, a soup, and a sandwich along the way. And meals were planned that way. Meals were made during the Great Depression of cheap stuff, right? Cheap stuff. Things like macaroni and beans and hot dogs, cornmeal, right? These are all things that people tended to use. Foods were generally chosen for their versatility. right? So if you, potatoes were big because you could do a lot of things with potatoes. You could fry them, you could mash them, you could boil them, you could turn them into home fries, those sorts of things. Eggs were very popular, a great source of protein, and all you really needed was a chicken, and the chicken could scavenge around the yard in order to live that way. Very often, a basic part of a meal might be what was referred to as paste. Paste. And paste could be anything made out of quite a number of things. It could be made out of corn, it could be made out of oat, it could be made out of cornstarch, those sorts of things. Or it could be made simply out of flour. So you would take some flour, you put some water with that, you would add a little salt, a little pepper, and then you'd mix that up and you could put that over toast. Okay, not exactly appetizing, but hey, it's better than starving. To beef that up a little bit, to make that a little more, culinarily appealing, you might add some jelly or some syrup or some fruit or some butter or maybe some cinnamon if you had those sorts of things around as well. So you really made these things stretch. Food rule number 2 was not only, did you have to waste nothing, but you had to stretch it. You had to make it last, and you had to make it filling. And so there was a lot of these paste type recipes. There was a lot of soups. Beans were eaten a lot during the 1930s. Boiled cabbage was another biggie, and boiled carrots, boiled beets, boiled potatoes. And again, if you have people that grew up during that time frame, or their parents grew up during that time frame, talk to them about food. And there were certain types of food that people would never eat again. I remember I had an uncle, a great uncle, my grandma's brother, and he said, if I ever see another bean again, I'm gonna, I wouldn't tell you what he said, but he didn't ever want to eat another bean because he'd eaten so many during the Great Depression. There were some specific examples of meals too that people had. There was a meal called poor man meal. The poor man meal. And poor man meal was basically mashed potatoes, because potatoes were pretty abundant. And in that, you would take the mashed potatoes and then you would cut up hot dogs, because hot dogs were pretty prevalent at that time as well, because of course hot dogs are made of all the other parts of the animal that you can't really use. So they were readily available, they were relatively inexpensive, and you could have yourself some form of protein and a starch in that meal with poor man meal. Meatloaf was also a very popular program during that time in terms of, meal in terms of that time. And so sometimes the meatloaf was actually made with meat, which was kind of nice. My grandmother used to make us meatloaf, and we used to call it lack loaf because it lacked any resemblance to any kind of real food. She insisted that there was food in there of real live food, but you couldn't make out whatever the heck was in there. So if you didn't have meat, you might make it out of cornmeal, you might make it out of breadcrumbs, you might make it out of flour, all sorts of things like that. There was also a type of pudding called dead bread pudding. Doesn't that sound appetizing? And that was simply stale bread that you would wet down with olive oil, salt, and soak it in boiling water. And then you could take it out and mash it into sort of a paste. And that could be eaten either mashed, or you could let it dry out a bit and then have it back as kind of a reconstituted bread, let's say. Mock apple pie was an apple pie made with Ritz crackers. Who would have thought? A mock turkey sandwich was basically a loaf of a piece of bread with a piece of lettuce, some mayonnaise, and another piece of bread. No actual turkey, but a mock turkey sandwich. And of course, dandelion salad, very important to have dandelion salad in what it was that you were serving, because the dandelions were growing right out in the front yard. And so it was a very close, food supply for you able to get. There were Hoover stews, and Hoover stew was kind of a malicious name for a stew that was made up of all different kinds of things. And it was sort of, you'd call it a Hoover stew, simply because, everybody was mad at Hoover for the Great Depression. They shouldn't have been. It wasn't his fault, but they didn't think he was doing enough about that. And a Hoover stew would be served in a family setting. In the hobo jungle, okay, in the hobo jungle, with the hobos would get together around the rail lines and rail yards and things, that Hoover stew would be referred to as a mulligan stew. And again, the idea was people would put in whatever they could, and they would contribute and be able to get food out that way. So the Great Depression was a time that really took people to live on their own wits. It was a time when people had to take stock of what they had, take stock of what they needed, take stock of what they could do without, and then pull together those things into a survival package, let's say, that got them through the Great Depression. Now, the thing about the Great Depression is nobody knew when it was going to end, right? So, some of these things you think, well, we'll just go through the beans and the, hot dogs and potatoes for, a couple of weeks, and then things will get better, a couple of months maybe. But sometimes this stuff lasted for years. And that's why the New Deal programs, things like the Civilian Conservation Corps or the WPA's lunch program, was so important. Because the Civilian Conservation Corps gave young men 3 square meals a day in exchange for the work they were doing out in the wilderness, and the school lunch program gave parents a sense of, okay, at least Johnny and Susie are going to get something to eat today, and of course, these foodstuffs were bought up. From local farmers and stuff, right? So, then they were making some money. They were able to sell their apples. They were able to sell their chickens, their eggs, those sorts of things. So it was a time where, you could survive if your supply chain was close. You could survive if you pooled resources with other folks. You could survive if you swallowed your pride and accepted that little bit of assistance that you needed along the way. And it was a situation where what the government was really trying to do was not to necessarily give out handouts. They were given help outs, right? They were helping people to get through and to get by as best as they could, so that they could survive through the Great Depression. When you wanted to have fun, you had to make it yourself. When you wanted to get a new dress, you either had to save up and save up and save up, or you ended up having to make do with a hand-me-down dress from somebody else. I love this. Here's a letter written January 17th, 1936, from a young girl in Bedford Avenue in Mount Vernon, New York. And I love this because this, again, shows you the resourcefulness. So this little girl had been looking at a magazine, and she had seen in the magazine that Eleanor Roosevelt got a new fur coat. And this little girl said, well, gee, if Eleanor Roosevelt got a new fur coat, that must mean there's an old fur coat. Okay? And so this little girl writes to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she says, "Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, in the paper I read that you will wear your beautiful new fur coat at the upcoming reception. As I am very proud of our First Lady, I think you should buy the coat and maybe give the old one to my mother. Mother wanted a fur coat for years, but could never afford to buy one, as father only gets $30 a week. Actually, $30 a week wasn't too bad. I am 12 years old, and nobody knows I'm writing you this letter, and wouldn't my mother be surprised if she got it, right? If she got the old fur coat? No one knows, so please don't tell anyone that I'm writing this, and thank you very much." And, this is, again, it's like an authentic letter from our collection of a little girl who's being resourceful. She's asking the First Lady for some old clothes. And this kid is smart. This kid knows how to play the angles, because she puts on here as a P.S., I'm a Girl Scout since last week, because she knew that Eleanor Roosevelt was the honorary head of the Girl Scouts while she was First Lady. So she was making sure she covered all the angles that way. So tough times called for innovative solutions, and people were able to come up with those. And if you talk to people from the Great Depression, or whose parents lived through the Great Depression, you will understand that it was an incredible time that made a tremendous difference in their lives. It never left them for the rest of the time that they were here on the planet. And they used those lessons, and they brought those lessons that frugality carried with them for the rest of their lives. We can learn a lot from the folks back in the Great Depression. Today, we have to sacrifice. The sacrifices that we make are not quite the sacrifices that that these folks had to make. So if you find yourself thinking, wow, things are tough and times are weird and everything is going kind of crazy, they are, but we've betted these situations before, and with a little ingenuity, a little reach out for help, and a little support from each other, we can get through it. So please make sure that you do. Okay, let's take a look and see if we have any questions that came in. Let's see. My grandma made crackers and coffee as breakfast during the Depression. She would crumble crackers in a bowl and add coffee, milk, and sugar. Right, okay. If you had those basic things, you had enough to put together a halfway decent meal. Do we know if the 12-year-old's mother got Eleanor's old fur coat? That's a great question. Mrs. Roosevelt got literally thousands of letters like that. And so what they would usually do is they would send back a response with the address of a local charity wherever this, in this case, Mount Vernon, where the person could go for help. So they might get the location of the local WPA office. So if you're having a hard time, send your mom or dad down to the WPA. Maybe we can get you a job that way. There were just too many requests coming in from people to the Roosevelts. And most people felt they could ask Mrs. Roosevelt for that sort of stuff. The president was too busy. We can't ask the president. But the Roosevelts were the people's president. The Roosevelts were going through the Great Depression with everyone else. They were very careful not to be extravagant in the White House. Their Christmas cards they sent out every year, very plain. The meals that they served in the White House throughout the Great Depression and the Second World War, very basic, very simple, because they were in it with everybody else. And that's the way they would do this. Where did soup lines get their food? Well, the soup kitchens and those sorts of things were generally set up very often through charities, churches, those sorts of places. And, they would have maybe a little bit of resources for that, to pay for those things. So they would buy them, the ingredients, either from local farmers, or they would buy them from local stores. And again, what this would do is help, spread the wealth across the community. As well. And when you went to a soup kitchen, that wasn't a great, it was a great opportunity to get a decent meal, but it wasn't like you were going in there and getting some big gourmet meal. I've got a picture of a guy here. Let's see. Okay, here we are. A gentleman at a soup kitchen. Let me see if I can get this in for you here. Nope. Nope, that's me. Okay. All right, so here's a gentleman at a soup kitchen. Now, again, look what you're seeing here, right? This is a pretty basic situation here. The mugs have got the handles have broken off, the mugs, and he's eating soup. You get some soup, watered down soup, probably a paste type of soup or a tomato-based soup or a potato-based soup, and a piece of bread and maybe a glass of water, milk, or coffee. So it wasn't like you were really getting a great, meal, but if that was the only meal you were getting that day, that was a great, great meal. So that was really important that folks had those little opportunities to do that and get by. Without knowing what I was doing, I spent my mother's last dime. I only knew how upset she was. This would be around 1938, 1939 when I was 4 or 5. All right, you were 4 or 5. So we're going to cut you some slack on that, okay? But, spending your mother's last dime in the Great Depression, you know what she probably had to do for that? She probably had to do tons and tons of washing and sewing and all of those sorts of things. So I don't want to make you feel bad. You were a child. You didn't know what you were doing. But that was really that was a big deal because, dimes and those sorts of things, nickels, dimes, pennies, quarters, money, didn't grow on trees, didn't fall out of the sky. It was really, really hard to come by, and you really, really had to work for it. And when you did, you really, really appreciated it. And that's, I think, really the big thing that came out of the Great Depression. Somebody said, I've heard it said that if you had a nickel, you'd squeeze it so hard that the buffalo pooped. You could do that. You could do that. I don't know what you would do with, well, you probably put the buffalo poop out in the garden, right? So you could grow some peas or some beans or those sorts of things as well. Okay, anything else? Any other questions, comments, or snide remarks coming through? Okay, so you may want to adopt some of these things to your way you're living now, right? Maybe you want to cut back on some of the utilities to, cut costs. Do you really need 134 channels? It's the same stuff over and over. Maybe you'll walk instead of, taking the bus, or buying gas for your car, those sorts of things. There's lots of ways that you can cut corners. There's lots of ways you can trim down on your expenses. And you can do it kind of as a hobby, or you could do it as a way to sort of, tighten up your budget. But during the Great Depression, people did it as a way to make ends meet. That's how they survived. Got one more new comment. Let's see what that is. Let's see, what year did everything start to turn around? That's a great question, Nancy asks. Things started to, it depends on where you were, right? Some things started to turn around almost immediately. If you didn't have a job and now you had a WPA job, your life was picking up, okay? That was a good thing. If you were a young man and you couldn't find a job, but you got into the CCC, that was a good thing. The Great Depression really began to end and really ended with World War II, with the massive amount of production that was needed for the war, and also the fact that we needed full employment. You either got in a uniform and went off to war, or you got in a factory and you made the machines and the necessary materials and such. So it was really the spending of the war that got us through they got us out of the Great Depression. But it was the New Deal programs, Franklin Roosevelt's 44 or so New Deal programs, that got us through the Great Depression. It got us through the hard times. There was a famous story about Franklin Roosevelt was working early in his presidency at his desk, and an aide came through and said, was kind of sucking up to the president. Oh, Mr. President, if these New Deal programs work, you're going to go down in history as the greatest president ever. And the story is that the president, without even looking up, responded, and if they don't work out so well, I will go down in history as the last president of the United States ever. That's how bad things were. Okay. Let's see. Here's which programs were the most popular and the most controversial? Oh, good question. The WPA was a very popular program. In fact, between the WPA, the CCC, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, half of the infrastructure in the United States was built during the Great Depression. And I would argue that it was that infrastructure that was built during the Great Depression that allowed us to become the arsenal of democracy for the Second World War. So I think that a lot of that was inadvertent early planning on Roosevelt's part. Certainly those were very popular projects because Roosevelt designed them to be popular. The idea of these programs, these projects, the WPA, was to create something in the community. Now, these job programs were very important for people because it not only gave you some income, it not only gave you some money, but it also gave you a purpose, right? So you weren't on the dole just getting a free handout. You were helping to build the hospital downtown. You were helping to build the library downtown. You were helping to lay the waterworks for the hydrant system that will protect the village now for the city for the rest, for the rest of the decade or the rest of the century. So these programs were very popular because it gave people a sense of making a contribution. And they were also very important because it showed what the government was doing right in your neighborhood. There was usually a big old sign out front, WPA project, sponsored by the Roosevelt administration, right? So the idea was you could see, how's the government helping me? What's the government doing? Hoover didn't do any of that. What's Hoover doing? I don't know. He's not doing anything. All right, let's name a stew after him. That'll fix him, right? But with Roosevelt, you would see this big sign out in front. Hey, here comes the new hospital. Here comes the new library. Hey, there's sidewalks over here now. I'm not twisting my ankle when I go to church on Sunday. These are all WPA projects, and it's the government helping out. And you want to know what? I have a job working on that. And that's my contribution to the community. So those were very popular. The National Recovery Administration programs, not so popular. That was one that tried to set price and ceilings and floors and those sorts of things, a code basically that businesses would use, to not undercut each other on prices and on quantities and those sorts of things. That was less popular because it was seen as a little bit too intrusive. In fact, the Supreme Court of the United States ended up declaring that unconstitutional because it was too much government messing into economic situations, which the Constitution bars that way. So that was a less popular one. There were the Civilian Conservation Corps, very popular. There was some controversy as World War II started to come along. Some people started to see it as sort of like an equivalent of the Hitler Youth, right? Which it wasn't, okay, because the Hitler Youth was an evil organization that was putting, thoughts in people's minds, young people's minds. Whereas what the Civilian Conservation Corps was trying to do was to put tools in their hands to create, things for the community and such. So there was sort of some unfavorable comparisons between those two. I would say unfavorable, and I'd also say unfair. So those were some of the more popular ones and some of the less popular ones. Okie dokie. Let's see. Thank you for mentioning the librarians that would give out books. Yeah, I have a whole talk on that. We do have some information on those folks here at the FDR library. And it was, in fact, implemented through the WPA, a very small program. About 1,000 women participated over the course of the program, from like 35 to 43, I think it ended. So maybe I can come back and do a talk on that sometime. Very, very important program because it gave women jobs and it gave people books, access to information. Very, very important. Okay, folks, we're just about out of time. Thanks for being with me today, and I look forward to presenting for you again in the not so distant future. Until then, look for ways to cut corners and save. And when you think you're having some hardships, you think you're having some troubles, you probably are, but let's keep them in comparison and, keep them in perspective. The folks in the Great Depression were facing incredible challenges, and they got through them through working together and keeping a positive attitude. So thanks so much, and we'll see you again next time.